and the Director of Gateway Neuropsychology. He leads a comprehensive neuropsychological testing and consultation practice for children, adolescents, and adults. And through his practice, he addresses a variety of needs for children, especially those with executive functioning skills. So we're really grateful for his time this evening. Tonight, Dr. Kaufman will guide us through the first three chapters of Smart but Scattered, and we will yield it over to Dr. Kaufman at this point, and I will let him share screen. Again, we are so grateful for your partnership and appreciate you being here this evening with us.
Okay, well, thank you all. I just want to say it's a real privilege to be here. I was very happy to hear about this book study, and happy to start off I guess the sequence of these that are coming up. So I'm going to share some slides that I have. And hopefully these look okay. We did a quick dry run earlier. I'll just also say a brief shout out to St. Louis University, where I'm also an associate professor. You see the blue SLU logo here, and my research lab is reflected there, where we study some of these principles of executive functioning. So really, really happy to be here with you tonight. So as we were kind of discussing this time that we've dedicated for this first of several sessions is really about setting the stage for conversation around executive functioning and executive skills. So, as was mentioned, I am a clinical neuropsychologist. I work with individuals of all ages, but primarily school-age children in often trying to understand where executive skill development is going and if that is contributing to difficulties that a child may experience, whether it be in their academics or in their social emotional development. And so, executive functioning skills, suffice it to say, are things that I think about quite often between my clinical practice and my research. I really like this book series. There's a number of smart but scattered books, and I think these books lay out executive functioning and executive skills in a really comprehensive way. I think one of the challenges is executive functioning and executive skills are terms that we as parents hear about a lot if we're tuning into the latest thinking and the latest findings on development and cognition and academic success. So in many ways, I feel like I'm going to be preaching to the choir here tonight. I feel like a lot of you are already going to be on pretty solid footing with regard to a lot of this terminology. But I do want to start with making sure we're kind of all on the same page. So when we think about how to define executive skills, these are cognitive abilities that help us plan, organize, manage our time, regulate our emotions, and achieve our goals. And it's really that last point that is sort of the primary reason that these abilities have evolved and have become what we rely on them to be in the modern age. These are absolutely essential for our independent living and success, and they can certainly impact whether or not we are meeting our goals, whether it be through our schoolwork, whether it be through our social friends and social skills, whether it be our home life. These are really integrally related to many, many aspects of our functioning. And I'll also point out that we see the results of executive functions in our children's decisions and actions, but we rarely actually see the underlying executive function in full display. Why do I make a point of that on the opening slide? When we're talking about executive functioning, it's very easy to assume that, well, we all have these labels, we all know what it means to manage time, as one example. But we don't see the breakdown when executive skills don't translate into success. What we see are the results. And so we're almost sort of like seeing a delayed reaction of what is either happening or not happening with our children's executive skills. And I think that framework for thinking about our own observations as parents is really important. The Smart but Scattered model focuses on 11 key executive skills. And this is, as I was saying, very comprehensive. You might find alternative models or alternative frameworks that might reduce the number of executive functioning skills, but I actually think all of these are unique enough and important in their own right to briefly highlight with you tonight. And I will just highlight that even though we often think about executive functions and executive skills as an area to improve upon, these can be co-occurring within the same individual as strengths and weaknesses. And in fact, most of us watching and listening and engaging in this discussion tonight have variable patterns of strengths and weaknesses across these different skills that we've relied on. Okay, so a closer look at the executive skills that this book outlines. We're going to start with response inhibition. So this is the ability to think before you act. This may include examples such as resisting the urge to say or do something, and allow yourself time to evaluate a situation, right? So when we think about parents of younger children out there, you might see examples of this, such as your child being able to wait for a short period of time without being disrupted, without interrupting, or kind of holding on to a goal. But we're talking about a relatively short period of time. So response inhibition is constantly updating as our environment changes. An older child example could be being able to accept a referee's call without arguing. And again, it reflects that idea that sometimes we can become briefly overwhelmed by emotions or calls to action within our own mind. And so these would be examples of things we might see across different ages. Another executive skill is working memory. Now, working memory is also a bit of a buzzword and a common term that gets thrown around. But the idea of memory and working and how does this differ from short-term memory? How does this differ from long-term memory? I think it deserves a moment to take stock. So working memory refers to the ability to hold on to information in mind while performing complex tasks. And oftentimes, the task requires that we don't just hold on to the information, but we actually do something active with it. That's where this name working memory comes from. So it's not just holding on to things in our short-term memory passively or sort of, just kind of from a maintenance standpoint. We're also manipulating and working some kind of problem out with working memory. This often requires us to draw on past learning and apply some kind of experience or context to a situation. So if we think about how this might show up in young children, children can hold in mind and follow maybe one or two-step directions, whereas older children may be able to remember the expectations of multiple teachers, such that as they're rotating through their course schedule and a teacher announces a quiz or a test, that child is relatively automatically able to recall, okay, what does that mean in this class, for this teacher, for this format? And so again, being able to hold on to those things in order to be able to implement them, again, in the short term. Um, okay. Next up, we have emotional control. Oftentimes, we think about executive skills as really a more of a cognitive thing, something that we rely on to think and to reason. But emotion is tightly connected to our thinking and our reasoning. And in fact, it's often a form of information that helps us make decisions. So I think it makes a lot of sense to think about emotional control as one of our executive skills. And we could define this broadly as the ability to manage emotions and in order to achieve goals, complete our tasks, or control or direct some form of our behavior. So if we think about our younger children, this could involve somebody who's recovering from a disappointment in a relatively short period of time. Maybe they found out that they're not going to be able to take that trip to the zoo that they had been looking forward to for weeks because it's raining or because something else came up. And being able to recover from that kind of a brief disappointment in a short amount of time could be a good example of that. With older children, it may be managing anxiety of a game or a test and still being able to perform. So again, there's definitely impact regardless of our age. Flexibility is another executive skill mentioned in the book. This is the ability to revise our plans in the face of obstacles or setbacks or changes or even our own mistakes. And so we can also think about this as being kind of like adaptability to changing conditions. So as exemplified by this brain doing a yoga pose, it's sort of about stretching our comfort zone and potentially changing, switching, stretching our plans. So again, a young child might be able to do this with a change in plans, kind of like we were talking about on the last example. And an older child may be able to accept an alternative, such as a different job or a different non-preferred activity when the first choice is not available. Sustained attention. So this is the capacity to keep paying attention. You all have been with me about 10 minutes now, so I think we are starting to test to test the limits of sustained attention, but we've got a ways to go. So we'll think back on this slide in about another 10 or 15 more minutes. But the idea of paying attention to a situation or a task in spite of things that could come up. And we live in a world of what feels like almost constant distractibility, and we also have fatigue and other things that can creep in. So with a younger child, this might be doing a chore with a parent for occasional supervision for a few minutes. With an older child, this might be being able to focus on homework for an hour or two without much need for maintenance and again, maybe with some short breaks. Okay, task initiation. So this is the ability to begin projects without procrastinating a lot, and it ultimately kind of getting started in a relatively efficient manner. So with younger children, this might be, again, being able to start an activity or a chore relatively quickly after instructions are given, right? With an older child, it may mean, hey, we've got a test to study for later this week. We're going to space it out during the week, or we're going to start early enough that we're confident we've got more than enough time, right? As opposed to waiting until the last minute. And growing up as a child of the 80s and 90s, I was a big fan of Calvin and Hobbes. And of course, Calvin has a few lines in occasional cartoon sketches about procrastination. And he describes how he really works best when he's in the right mood, such as last minute panic, which of course is funny when Calvin says it, but when we see it in our own kids, it's not as funny. And we want them to develop a healthier perspective with this. With planning and prioritizing, again, something Calvin and Hobbes has a little bit more to share in yet another cartoon strip on this slide. So planning is obviously about more than just avoiding procrastination. It's about creating a roadmap to reach a goal. And it's often going to involve multiple steps. It's often going to involve multiple decisions. And it's a marathon, not a sprint. So with a younger child, we want to think about with coaching, how could a child think of something that doesn't come to them immediately? Maybe how they navigate a conflict with a peer, right? So it's not something that requires, dozens of steps, but something that requires more than just one quick reaction. With an older child, this might be steps to apply for a job or apply to college, right? So again, a lot more complexity. And here in this cartoon strip, Calvin is referring to how his teacher gave him multiple days to do the assignment, but he knows that he's just going to do it on the last evening anyway. So again, not only is he a master of procrastination, but he's sort of eschewing planning as a goal here, which is not a good model for our kids. So when my kids read Calvin and Hobbes, I always try to remind them this is not a role model, even though when they were young, they really thought he was. Okay, with organization. Organization is something that we all know when we see it, but it's not just physically lining up and putting things in the right spot. It's really having a system that can track and manage information. So with younger kids, we might give them a reminder and they may know that, hey, I put my toys in this spot, right? I have a spot for something. That's a great skill to begin highlighting organization when kids are young, even really young. With older children, this may be organizing and locating things and becoming more independent as they go, perhaps with their own sports equipment or other materials that they might need. Okay, time management. This is a big one because this can set the stage for so many other executive functioning skills. So we kind of all know what it means to manage our time well, but we can't always, I think, appreciate where the breakdown occurs. So with managing time, we have to remember that this is really relying to a certain degree on the capacity to estimate how much time one has, how they're going to allocate it, how much time the task is going to take, right? And then how do I stay within, reasonable limits of that? Um, Also a sense that time is important, right? That time is kind of a precious thing that you don't get back once it's gone. So with younger children, again, this could be when we set an activity or a job to a short time limit and we're able to meet that goal and recognize the purpose of that goal. With older children, this may require establishing a more complicated schedule to meet their task demands. And as this kind of infographic on the slide shows, we can think about time management from a calendar perspective. We can also think about it from more of a momentary perspective, whether we're actually referring to a clock or a timer. We often need real life experience of demonstrating and kind of testing our knowledge of time, not just how to tell time on a clock. But what does 5 minutes feel like when you're doing math problems for homework? What does 10 minutes feel like when you're cleaning up your room? What does 30 minutes look like when you're studying for a test? What does it not only look like, what does it feel like? And unfortunately, time blindness is a concern that some people might anecdotally describe, where the time just blows by. Everybody can experience this, of course, but when we need to anchor and lock in, we really want to be able to appreciate time and manage it. Okay, what about goal-directed persistence? So this is kind of like sustaining our attention, but it sort of relates back to completing a goal, not just sustaining for the purpose of focusing, but really completing a goal and recognizing where we are and not get distracted by competing interests. So again, completing a job in the classroom in order to get to recess, or completing some kind of task so you can be rewarded with something you want to do later. With an older child, this could be earning and saving money over time. That requires a lot of goal-directed persistence and starts to become important as teenagers are thinking about how they want to spend their money. And then we've got metacognition. So metacognition refers to the ability to be able to kind of take perspective, sort of reflect, and almost kind of zoom out and observe yourself from a problem-solving standpoint. This is often going to require things like self-monitoring, self-evaluation, so that you kind of know where you are and you know what needs to be done and potentially what needs to be changed if your progress and your tracking isn't quite working out. So for a younger child, this might involve changing behavior in response to feedback. And with an older child, this may involve monitoring and critiquing their performance in order to improve it, and potentially even again kind of reflect on observing others who have more skill in this area. So kind of being teachable, being coachable on a higher level. Okay, deep breath. We persisted through my goal of outlining all 11 of the executive skills highlighted in this book. So what else do we need to say? We've talked about them, that's just now kind of giving us a shared vocabulary. So a few other key points, and this kind of transitions now a little bit more into later sections of the book content for today. So obviously executive skills develop over time. Just like our children's physical growth, their cognitive and executive skill growth is changing. And this is a gradual process. It may seem at times that there are big transition periods where a child is now suddenly handling more complexity and needing more executive skill. And that is true to a degree. But we have to keep in mind these are very gradual, and these don't actually finish developing until we're in our mid 20s. So executive skills are throughout the developmental period truly a work in progress. We know that there's a number of aspects of brain development that correlate with this. And so executive skill development is really influenced by our own biological ability to handle executive functioning tasks. So these can be influenced loosely by genetics, also by our environment, including, the procedures, the habits, the lessons and reinforcements we've had over life. But brain development, in particular in the prefrontal cortex, is critical. And we'll talk a bit more about the prefrontal cortex because, again, like executive skills, a lot of people hear about the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe more broadly. And I want to unpack a little bit more depth about that. Many people often describe as executive skills as sort of being a use it or lose it. I think lose it is a bit harsh, but if you don't use it, you're not gonna develop it. You're not gonna grow it. You really have to practice these in order to support these abilities and to strengthen the very brain structures that make it easier to carry out these functions. Okay, I'm gonna briefly turn into my professorial mode here for just a minute. This is actually a slide that I include regularly in my graduate courses on neuropsychology and neuroscience. And to be fair, it's a simple slide to start off with. It's got some colorful regions of the brain highlighted. And you don't have to be a graduate neuropsychology student to be able to track what I'm about to say. But I do want to add a little bit of depth to the kind of the brain basis of our understanding here. And again, I will try to keep it brief. So in the areas highlighted on the slide as sort of a bluish purple color, those are our primary sensory areas of the brain. So in the very far back of the brain, we have our visual cortex. In the middle of our top of our temporal lobe, we have our auditory cortex. At the very top of our parietal lobe, we have our somatosensory cortex, which manages the sense of touch. All of these different sensory cortices take in a ton of information through our bodies, through our eyes, through our ears. And all of this information um, gets processed in essentially the back half of our brain. At least this is sort of where it's primarily processed. But all of those sensory inputs get funneled to the front of our brain. And to keep this diagram simple, I don't have all of those pathways depicted. But all of these blue centers of incoming sensory information, they don't just take that information and then say, okay, good, I see what's going on in the world. I hear what's going on. They integrate it. And where this integration takes place is in the frontal lobe. So the integration starts in sort of the inferior or lower portion of the frontal lobe, in a region that we call the orbital frontal cortex. And it actually also includes contributions from the medial prefrontal cortex. This region of the brain sort of starts the integration process. And in order to start this, what these regions of the brain are really doing is they're asking from a reward basis, right? From a pleasure basis, from a motivational basis. What is it that's going on? And do I need to care, right? How does this affect me? So this is how our executive functions kind of get kindled. And then passing signals to other regions of the frontal lobe, we get a more organized response. And this is largely happening in the lateral prefrontal regions. So we're organizing, we're kind of maintaining information over time. We're tracking it, we're holding on to it over a period of time that sort of forms the basis of working memory. Then, after we've got enough organization, other parts of the frontal lobe start getting involved in terms of planning what are we going to do about those organized sensory impulses that have now been combined with our own personal motivations. And so there's motor planning cortex. Now, this may not be thought of as sort of a key contributor to executive functions, but that's what executive functions lead to, is ultimately motor planning. How are we going to act? What are we going to say? Where are we going to go? right? What are we going to write? These are all motor tasks that our brain does. And then ultimately, this portion of the brain that's more of the red pink center that actually executes our actions. And so we've got these multi-staged, discrete stages of processing within executive functions. That's why we get so many colorful combinations of executive functions as we're thinking about these different abilities that the book lays out. Okay, so when we think about our frontal lobes, sometimes people will even refer to parents being kind of like the child's frontal lobes early on. So we provide structure, we provide support until a child is able to function more independently with their own executive skills. And parents can use modeling and routines and maybe sort of even back and forth interactions, like you sort of throw something out almost like a tennis serve and you kind of wait for it to come back to respond and to reflect. These are all great skills that we probably do without even really thinking about it. We also need to give our children boundaries. That helps them establish what is appropriate and not appropriate limits of behavior, and that is important for fostering executive functioning. But there can still be many challenges. So executive skill challenges can arise from genetics. Maybe we just don't have as strong of executive functioning skills in certain aspects based on a kind of our own biology and our kind of our own brain strengths and weaknesses. Maybe it's something else that has sort of shunted our development, maybe trauma, or maybe some kind of clinical disorder has developed that sort of complicates, right, and interferes with some of these executive functions. There can also just be normal developmental variations. Not every child is going to be strong in every executive skill, and to a certain extent, to a degree, that can be completely normal. Now, many clinical disorders involve executive skill deficits. Some of the questions that I think came in through the Google form included questions about ADHD, questions about autism spectrum disorder. Yes, those are two clinical disorders that are perhaps maybe among the best known in how they contribute and are correlated and have executive function challenges, sort of as part of the clinical symptoms. However, there can be so many combinations that even if two children have ADHD, their executive skill challenges could be very different. And definitely true with autism spectrum and other disorders. So it's difficult to map a profile onto every clinical disorder out there, but executive skill deficits are in fact quite common with a variety of different clinical populations. So there was a case example presented in the book that highlighted a young girl looking in her house for her tablet, and her mom is calling to her that she has, maybe 10 minutes to get ready to leave, and Clem, the daughter, is saying, "Oh, well, can I watch a show on my tablet, right?" And mom is probably in a different room calling out saying, "Yeah, that's fine. You got 10 minutes." But the problem is Clem doesn't find her tablet in short order. So she's looking for it, distracted, finding it, having trouble finding it, kind of going through, ripping couches off of the sofa, ultimately having a bit of a meltdown as this interaction culminates. And what it simply, reminds us, and again, all of us have probably been there a time or two as parent, maybe more than a couple times when we have poor task initiation, which may be one way of characterizing what happened, when maybe we have poor disorganization, the tablet wasn't left in an organized spot, and so because of that, Clem didn't know where to go find it, right? And then sustained attention appeared to be a challenge. So we've got at least three executive skills that intersected in that one simple and common moment, right? But this illustrates how everyday situations can be just filled with executive functioning opportunities, and they can be difficult when kids have deficits or challenges in these areas. Okay, so transitioning now towards thinking about how can we as parents identify our child's executive skills from both a strengths and kind of a weakness or a challenge framework. So we want to understand how executive skills manifest in everyday behaviors and keeping in mind the vocabulary of how these executive skills are discrete and different while being somewhat overlapping and related too. That's a real key part because if we don't understand what is the challenge for a child, where is the breakdown occurring, it's going to be very, very difficult to come up with an intervention that helps. We have to keep in mind developmental expectations are hugely important here. We have to keep in mind as parents what tasks are typical for our child's age range and what tasks might be too advanced. This can also be impacted by clinical disorders like ADHD, where the brain is not maturing with certain executive skills at the same rate as a normal brain. So with ADHD, Russell Barkley has advocated and spoken about a 30% rule in the past that kids with ADHD on average are going to be about 30% delayed with certain key executive functions. So we have to keep that in mind when we're framing our developmental expectations for our own children. And we have to keep in mind that we're not giving them tasks that are too hard. We can also identify these by observing how children interact with other children, right? Because it's not just instructions parents give where we see those examples of executive functioning breakdowns. It can be with any kind of decision making or task that requires flexibility. Okay, so ultimately from this, we want to take away a key insight that there are patterns of strengths and challenges with our kids. It is not going to be all challenges. It is not all going to be all strengths. I don't think I've ever met a child who didn't have some balancing act of strengths and challenges. And so that's both good news and it's also somewhat humbling, right? Because we can't expect, it's not realistic to assume that our children are going to have strengths in every executive skill. But what we can do is learn how to help them identify it and understand it from a strengths weakness profile so that we're playing to our strengths and using what works well for our strengths to try to kind of apply some interventions to help boost the weaknesses. Executive skills often cluster together, right? So there could be multiple related skills, not just one in isolation that ends up being a strength or a weakness. The book provides some rating scales that can be a really great way for a parent to take stock of sort of a self-assessment or a parent assessment of a child's executive skill profile. And if you ever consult with a professional, whether it be a pediatrician or a neuropsychologist, there are a number of other rating scales that might dig a little deeper or go in a slightly different direction to help characterize these. What we want to do throughout this is really think long and hard first about the strengths that our children are exhibiting. Because if we can reinforce those existing strengths, that will help them build confidence and encourage stretching themselves. It's very hard to challenge yourself without confidence. And so we want to focus on strengths first and foremost. But then we want to target specific executive skill weaknesses with tailored interventions. And I know that this is a big question. Today is not going to provide as many revelations around targeted interventions as you are going to get later in the book series, but I promise we will talk about a little bit. The importance of mindset is also important throughout all of this. So the first step in coming up with any kind of intervention plan to boost executive skills is to first help children understand that they can do better if they use their executive functions. So there's a really great book that is written primarily for clinicians about building organizational skills, and the citation for this is on the bottom of the screen. So Gallagher 2014, and I really like his framework. He refers to these disruptions in executive skills as glitches. And he actually personifies these. So he introduces several glitches as kind of like cartoon characters in his book, mental glitches that get in the way but can be overcome. I think the benefit of this, especially for younger kids, is that if you personalize a process like a glitch in executive skill, it makes it a little bit more understandable. It makes it a little bit more relatable, and it provides a little bit of hope that, hey, this isn't me. This is a part of me that I can kind of label as being a little bit different than the core person, who, by the way, Gallagher sort of refers to as a superhero. So he really tries to pump up the kids' confidence and hopefulness. We also want to try to recognize there are often two mindsets that creep in when we're looking at challenge areas. A fixed mindset sort of teaches us that, well, you either get it or you don't. And it really doesn't matter how hard you try because you're either born with it or not. And it kind of creates this fatalistic perspective that's not healthy for growth or change. And then we can adopt an alternative growth mindset where the underlying premise is that you can always grow and learn. And effort is not only something that makes a difference, but there's really no way to grow other than putting in effort, right? You have to practice. And it really can even, this might sound a little lofty, but it even can be viewed as a process to be enjoyed rather than something that just is to be avoided and something that feels painful and boring. Okay. One final point that is raised in these first few chapters that I think is good to highlight is that our own executive skills can interact with how we manage and how we help our children's executive skills. So, as I was saying before, children always exist with a balance of strengths and weaknesses. Adults do as well. And it could, in fact, be that some of your executive skills strengths as a parent are similar to those as your child, but it could be that it's very different, right? So the goodness of fit is relevant to reflect on. So if there's a big mismatch between your executive skill profile and your child's, that can lead to conflict and hinder their development. Now, it can't be overcome. The conflict is not a deal breaker here. But if we don't recognize it, we might be constantly butting up against a mismatch of our skills and theirs. And it might take us longer to realize that than we sometimes want. So I think pointing that out is a good idea. Self-awareness as a parent, therefore, is an important key. It allows you to be more empathic. It also allows you to be more knowledgeable about how to help them intervene and possibly reflect more on your own areas of growth. Sometimes we have the same strengths but different challenges than our kids. And again, we can work together to leverage those. That can kind of create a common understanding. And sometimes we might have the same challenges but very different strengths. And so again, if that is the case, we might need to work and kind of acknowledge a little humility with them, right? So, if, for example, I'm a real big procrastinator and I'm trying to teach my child not to be like me, I may have to make a little bit of light of it, right? So that they can see the humanity of me in that instance, at least, right? So that they might be able again to distance themselves from some of my habits that I might not want them to be learning. There's a case example from the book that highlights a brief scenario like this that again is probably something many of you can relate to. So Mindy and her dad are often in the school drop-off and pickup routine, and Mindy is highly time conscious and gets upset when her dad is late. But her dad doesn't really place as much priority on being on time, and he doesn't think it's the big deal to be late, and he's just kind of nonchalant about it. But that kind of becomes a source of conflict. And as you can imagine, that conflict can grow over time. So what this example can highlight is an executive skill mismatch where Mindy's strength in time management clashes with her dad's. And so again, a lack of understanding between parents and children could just exacerbate this, right? It could be kind of like a communication breakdown where they're not really on the same page. And that's why we want to highlight these things and it's difficult sometimes to embrace them, especially in front of our kids when we want to be the parent who's a good role model, but we do need to talk about them. Okay. In terms of, this fit between children and parents, strategies for managing situations may differ between you and your child. But here is the real kicker. The perfect intervention is going to support executive skill development in one simple way that takes no more than 5 or 10 minutes a day to implement, and something that you're willing to do with them and that they're willing to do for the long term, right? That's kind of idealistic, right? We might not always hit perfect, but that's the goal, is that we want to have a simple target. If we pack too much into trying to boost and change our executive skills, it's going to probably feel too overwhelming and we might not make progress on any of them. So we really want to think about highlighting, isolating, and recognize the value of doing things one at a time as much as we can. Okay. With stress and overload, stress can absolutely exacerbate our executive skill challenges, making it important to manage stress levels, not just in the moment of a disagreement with a parent and a child, but overall baseline levels of stress. It will allow everybody to function better. And as parents, we also want to exhibit reflective listening so that we can really try to understand and show our children that we care about how they feel. We see how they feel, whether it's a struggle, whether it's a discrepancy and a poor fit with maybe our skills and our style. But we want to be reflective, especially as our children age and get older into the teenage years. If we're not exhibiting reflective listening, they're gonna pull away and make it even harder to intervene. One concept that I don't think was introduced in these first three chapters is the notion of SMART goals. So I want to take a moment briefly just to identify what we call SMART goals. So SMART goals are a framework used to set clear and achievable objectives with any kind of decision that we might be making. And it can apply to a lot of different fields. But in our particular case, we can think about when we're looking at executive skills we want to improve, we want the goal to be specific, right? We want it to be clear and specific, not too broad, not too lofty, not too open-ended. We want it to be measurable. So we want to know how we're going to track progress. How are we going to know when we've achieved our goal? We want it to be achievable or attainable. So it needs to be realistic. We want it to be relevant, something that is, important and aligns with other things that are important. And then we want it to be time limited or time bound. It should not be a never-ending goal, at least when we're initially trying to engage with it. So this acronym SMART can be helpful with that regard. Okay, so then a summary of chapters 1 through 3. Executive skills are essential for our work in school, work when we're thinking about our own lives, and broader life. A variety of different skills work together to help us manage our behavior, direct our action, and achieve our goals. And understanding these skills can help us and help our children's teachers to support their executive skill development. So a big part of this is identifying strengths and weaknesses, helping to plan for interventions, looking for patterns that result in breakdowns, as well as executive skills uh, being practiced regularly, recognizing that without that effort and a growth mindset, we're probably not going to get very far. And we have to reflect on our own executive skill strengths and weaknesses in order to best fit them and suit them to our child's needs. And again, I recommend using SMART goals whenever possible. Okay, so that is kind of the end of my summary of chapters 1 through 3. Had a couple of other slides I was going to present, but I'm gonna skip to questions right now. And if it's helpful, I do have a couple of slides prepared on some recommendations about what parents could potentially do. But I want to turn to the questions now, if that's okay. And Sarah, should I stop my screen share for this, or should I keep it going in case it refers back to any of the other content?
I think there would be time to keep going with the presentation, and then for us to open for questions, and those questions can be submitted through the chat.
Okay.
I think that that will probably work best.
Okay,
And then if
great.
there's questions that we don't get to this evening, we can also post those on our Google site with the responses and answers there. So we
Okay.
don't want to miss the content of what you have prepared. Um,
So would you be
we can
comfortable
also
with me
monitor the
showing?
chat for those questions. And then one other piece I would share is that if families can try to make the questions general, and not too specific to their child so that other families can benefit from the responses, that would be fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, Sarah. So while you're looking through and we're giving people an opportunity to enter questions in the chat, I am gonna just go backwards if it lets me here. Oh, it's not gonna let me. Let me let me just so yeah, I don't know why it wasn't letting me go backwards, but let me just reopen this. So what parents can do in this oh, hold on. Are you guys seeing this? No, sorry, we lost it. Okay. Bear with me. Yeah, I normally can go backwards, so sorry about that. Um, okay, so what parents can do, this might also be involved in some of the questions that come up, so I will just outline a few steps here. So when parents are trying to make sense of these things, I would recommend that you document what you are noting. It could be a mental note, but if this is a pattern and if it's rising to a level of concern, I would actually keep a little record of details. You know, what was happening in a particular situation that you think might be linked back to executive skills. If you want to get real detailed, you might even include specific examples or patterns, right? Just to kind of make it easier to go back with. I think that if there's a possible impact on school, consulting with teachers and educators um, is really critical. I know that this can sometimes be like two different worlds colliding because sometimes our kids um, act or maybe appear very different at school than they do at home. And that's a real discrepancy. That can be a real difference, right? But I do think communicating to teachers about or counselors about concerns or about questions and being available for that two-directional communication, I think is really critical. Possibly scheduling a pediatric evaluation with your child's pediatrician to share your observations if there is feedback from school, and maybe to just kind of help think through could there be any medical issues or any general advice. Um, Seeking neuropsychology assessment, like what I provide to my clients, I mean, this is an option to get a much more in-depth view of what might be going on, particularly if there's a diagnostic reality that hasn't been identified, right? But you don't have to skip to a neuropsychologist. I think, again, monitoring yourself, checking in with school is great. Requesting school-based support if, again, the concerns are impacting academic performance. Possibly, again, requesting one of the formal evaluations or sort of educational plans that they can set up. Consulting with other specialists, such as occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, or others who could potentially help build executive function skills. And then working with those different professionals as relevant to create an intervention plan, right? Which could include behavioral strategies, organizational tools, possibly therapy or educational accommodations. And then I would recommend, again, continuing to regularly reflect on this and review progress and, touch base with involved professionals. Because again, executive functions don't develop in a straight line, so there can be ongoing need for adjustments. Okay, so those are the additional slides. Thank you for letting me fit those in, especially as we let some of the questions come in. I will go ahead and navigate out of my slides so that you're not just stuck looking at that screen. And I'm happy to take a look at questions. I'm looking at the chat now. Sarah, did you have any thoughts on where you wanted me to start?
Yes, we had some great questions in the chat. If we want to begin with, is there a best order to progress through executive skills, or is there a priority of one over another?
Oh boy, that's a great question.
Fantastic.
Um, yeah, great question. Like so many things, I think that it is kind of hard to say that there's always going to be one best. I think it's going to relate to um, the makeup of your child, how these executive skills interact with other aspects of their personality, of their ability levels, etc. But I guess also in particular, like if there is a difficulty that is showing up, maybe they're having trouble with response and inhibition. That was the first executive skill mentioned in the book and kind of outlined by me earlier tonight. That isn't necessarily the most important, but just starting with that one since it was presented first. If there is an area where it seems like there are themes, I would say the best order to progress in would be where you see themes of growth being needed the most. That would kind of be my answer to that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaufman. Another question that we had in the chat was, can children diagnosed with moderate ADHD outgrow it if the executive functioning skills are strengthened?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So the notion of ADHD, we think about ADHD as a disorder that shows up in childhood, right? And so by definition, it is something that is typically being diagnosed in childhood. Now, sometimes it might be missed and then diagnosed later, but what we do know from tracking children longitudinally is that a number of children diagnosed with ADHD no longer meet full diagnostic criteria when they're adults. And so you could consider that outgrowing, I suppose, right? Because, the brain maturation, finally catching up, and other skills being boosted could both be playing a role with that. I do think that in many cases, though, and I know some studies, I don't know if this is the latest research, but I know some studies have estimated as much as half of children diagnosed with ADHD will go on to continue to exhibit significant symptoms as an adult. So knowing that it's fairly common, I would say it may not be that the symptoms go all the way away, especially with a more moderate severity of ADHD, but the symptoms change, and the tools to manage it can absolutely help with how a person functions. So I think the short answer to that question would be yes. And I think that the longer caveat is it is going to depend a lot on the person and the demands and how those fit their broader skills.
Okay, we have another question that came in. Thank you, Dr. Kaufman. How would you advise a child who is advocating for themselves to effectively collaborate with individuals who may not support their challenges with executive functioning?
Yeah, so how would I advise a child who's advocating for themselves and the individuals, like I'm assuming the adults in their life may not be supporting their challenges? Yeah, that is tough. What it would seem to me on the surface of that question is that um, there may be there may be a lack of understanding or there may not be full opportunity. If it's opportunity, right? If, for example, the individuals in their life, the adults, whether they be teachers or family members, um, aren't supporting their challenges enough, it could be because they're just not aware of them, right? It could be that they're not seeing them or maybe they're misattributing them. So I think it could be a deeper conversation that would preferably happen in a scenario that felt safe to the child, certainly. I would never want a child to put themselves on a limb with an adult and make themselves vulnerable by admitting something or commenting on something that then they again they shouldn't have to be doing. I also think though um, again, there probably needs to be a deeper conversation with others in their life. Again, other family members, other teachers, etc. So I think this would be the kind of thing that would preferably happen in kind of a setting where there could be again a depth of communication added to whatever might be missed. And that could be a simple conversation where a child is simply trying to explain their point of view honestly and authentically. And I think that could be a very appropriate place to start if a child felt safe with that. If that didn't seem to help, it might be helpful to have a deeper conversation with others involved who might be able to, again, help bridge, some of those communication challenges.
And I would further add that both myself, I know this is a little confusing because we've got Miss Turner on my screen, but I'm Sarah Davidovitz. So for speaking for both of us, that we would encourage you as a parent, if that's happening in the school-based setting, to also, in addition to the advocacy, reach out to the teacher, reach out to administrators for support because we want to ensure that students are being heard, families are being heard, and that needed supports are happening to support your child. It looks like we have time for one more question. Are there complementary executive functions? For example, my daughter has a very difficult time with time management. Is there a skill that is a natural complement to that deficit to strengthen her weakness? Sits. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So if a child has challenges with time management, Um, and I would imagine, again, not knowing too many particulars about this situation, I would imagine that time management may lead or be associated with difficulties planning and prioritizing, right? And it may lead with difficulties with organization. But if by chance either of those two, other executive skills, organization or planning, are more of a strength area, those could really help and pick up the pieces of left behind from time management. I would also say I should also probably group task initiation into those. So when I think about some of the more kind of time sensitive executive skills, um, that I think can complement each other, and complement that sense of managing time. I think initiating tasks and really trying to break down obstacles such that tasks can be started as early as possible and as easily as possible. We always want to make it as easy as we can to take on something new. And so task initiation, planning, and organization would be the skills that come to mind. Now, if a child is also similarly challenged in all of those other areas that can relate back to time management, then again, it might be helpful to think a little bit more about other strength areas. What they can do well can probably ultimately impact timing of what they get done. But again, I think a lot of times concrete tools to help track time, as simple as that might sound, can often go a long way, even with our older teens, who maybe haven't had to pay as much attention to time before they're in high school, and but then when they're dealing with more academic demands, they really might have to become much more familiar and much more closely monitoring their time. Um, so that would be some of my initial thoughts. Good question.
Fantastic questions this evening. Thank you so much to everyone that posted questions in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Kaufman, for your time this evening and for your expertise. Again, just to reiterate on behalf of myself, I'm Sarah Davidovitz, Director of Special Education for Ladue School District, and Ms. Turner. We truly value your input as families, and you know your children best, and we appreciate the time that you've put in this evening. It's a commitment to your love and advocacy for your children. So thank you so much for your time. The second part of our presentation in this book study will occur on January 13th. We have Miss Keely Steffens, who is a board certified behavior analyst, who will be covering chapters 4 through 7, which is laying a foundation that can help. We hope to see you there. There will be recordings of this presentation and future presentations on the Google site that was shared with you all when you registered. There's going to be a lot of resources that we continue to post there, and we really, really appreciate you being here this evening. Thank you all so very much. Some great questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was a lot of fun, Sarah.
Thank you.
I can send you my slides if that would be helpful to disseminate to people or add to the website. Yeah, anything else in follow-up that I can do to be helpful?